what I'm going to try to do for you is to paint a panorama of the American conservation movement and to show how the deep ecology movement, which I'm nearly but not completely equating with what I call the pagan environmental movement, is all about. So that's what we're talking about, sort of in broadest terms, the American conservation movement, and then looking at deep ecology, what I'm calling the pagan environmental movement in the midst of that. And in order to set the mood, what I'd like to do is read a few paragraphs of the opening of a paper that I've been working on. The darkness of the high desert night retreated immediately into the shadows as the FBI's flares launched skyward. The light signaled 30 heavily armed agents to descend on the 3 ecological saboteurs and 1 FBI infiltrator huddled below the giant electrical towers. 2 of the saboteurs were quickly seized. The other disappeared into the shadows. Running at first with the wild abandon of all prey, when she first paused to catch her breath, once again, she began to mystically descend into earth, deeply feeling her sacred connection with this land, sensing it merging with her, surrounding her, protecting her. Awe and calm came with her descent into the Earth Mother. She knew she had become invisible, ghost-like. When the helicopters passed overhead, she hugged a tree or pressed herself into the ground, invisible. Secure in this sacred mind space, she thought, they would never find her. Several hours later, she slipped past her pursuers guarding a road on the edge of town, still imperceptible. Back in the mundane world, the next day at work, Peg Millett was seized and arrested. But she was not surprised, separated as she was from the Earth's protective intention by the impermeable concrete of the building's foundation. Mark Davis had been quickly seized that night. He was soon charged with several different acts of ecotage, including an effort designed to thwart the expansion of a ski resort in Arizona's San Francisco Mountains, an area considered sacred by Hopi and Navajo tribes. In a letter from a federal penitentiary, he explained this particular action. Certainly there was some outrage at the blatant disregard of agreements with the Hopi and Navajo tribes, anger at the destruction of hundreds of acres of irreplaceable old-growth forest for the new ski runs, and indignation that the Forest Service was subsidizing a private company with public dollars. But the bottom line is that these mountains are sacred, and that what has occurred there, despite our feeble efforts, is a terrible spiritual mistake. Now, perceiving natural places or parts of the natural world as sacred places might seem quite strange to us. Certainly, acts of sabotage and risking one's freedom in defense of the natural world may seem even stranger. But when we look at the American conservation movement, we can see that many, if not most, of the prominent figures have been animated by similar spiritual sentiments. So today what I'd like to do is introduce you to the American conservation movement, especially focusing on what I call the pagan environmental movement. This movement is a subset of the so-called deep ecology movement, but my own impression is that most deep ecologists are also pagan in their spiritual perceptions, and thus, to talk about the deep ecology or radical environmental movements is almost the same thing as to be talking about pagan environmentalism. Okay. Well, what I'd like to do is start off by characterizing for you 2 major types of environmental philosophical ethics that began to emerge the last part of the previous century, the late 1900s. The tensions within environmental movements since then, to a great extent, can be traced to these fundamental disagreements articulated that really began to be articulated about 100 years ago. On the one hand, we have Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot on the other, we have John Muir. Pinchot was a utilitarian conservationist, an anthropocentric utilitarian conservationist. What's all that mean? Well, on the one hand, he was concerned about the natural world because he perceived that it was under threat and that the assaults on the natural world ultimately worked against the human interest and the human well-being. Moreover, he was something of a political progressive, influenced by utilitarian philosophy. And so he thought that actions were right that maximized the total human well-being, or the average satisfactions of individuals. And so combining a human-centered environmentalism, concern for the environment because it's important to humans, with an egalitarian or an equality-based utilitarianism, he came to the conclusion that we needed to more carefully manage our natural resources. Pinchot was of kind of patrician origins, came from a very elite and wealthy family. He had the opportunity to go and study in Germany in the late 1900s. He was very impressed with the German forestry experiments, which at the time basically involved monocultures, cutting down forests and planting rows of similar species trees. But at the time, that was kind of the state of the art. It seemed to Pinchot to reflect the way to go in terms of managing forest resources. And having been in New England primarily, he could see the effect that deforestation was happening there, and he could see the effect in Europe of not having done careful management in previous centuries, and he wanted to bring careful forest management here. Pinchot ends up hanging out a shingle, becoming the first forester or forestry consultant in the United States. Ultimately, he becomes the first director of the United States Forest Service. The first director of the United States Forest Service. Again, late 1900s, he gets that position. And the philosophy of the United States Forest Service essentially is then derived from Gifford Pinchot. It's a utilitarian, human-centered philosophy. We ought to manage our resources well because human well-being depends on it, and it should not just be the rich who can benefit from them, but indeed all people should be able to benefit from them. Okay? The overall social well-being should be protected through careful management of natural resources. Well, more or less at the same time, there was a guy named John Muir. John Muir grew up in Wisconsin. I believe he was born in Scotland, but he very quickly came here with his Scotch Presbyterian family. And became very connected to the natural world. Was really quite an innovative guy. Went to the Madison State Fair as an inventor, had all sorts of interesting gadgets that created quite a fanfare. Began to go into industry, was an inventor and foreman when he suffered an industrial accident that almost took his sight. That revolutionized his life. Ever since then, since that time, he began to equate God with life. And he set out on long journeys. One of the early ones was a trip on foot down to the Gulf of Mexico. And on that trip, he came to one of his many striking insights. His Christian theological background had suggested to him that the natural world was created by God for human beings. But on that walk, he became convinced that the natural world, or that there was a significant amount of the natural world that, if anything, was hostile to human beings, such as mosquitoes and alligators. That experience of being afraid in natural places began to suggest to his mind that maybe the natural world was not just laid out there as a cornucopia for human consumption. He was also influenced by the transcendentalist writers, people like Emerson and Thoreau. He eventually journeyed to the Sierra Nevada mountains, where he had a variety of epiphanies, which is a fancy word for spiritual experiences in the wilderness. Now, these experiences could be labeled accurately both pantheistic and animistic. Now, pantheism, of course, is the perception that the natural world, conceived of as a whole, is divine or is imbued with divinity. The entire natural world is sacred. that was definitely one of the perceptions that Muir came to in the wilderness. Moreover, Muir had a variety of what we would call animistic perceptions. The perceptions that entities within the natural world, both living and non-living, were animate in some sense, had spirit, and that at certain moments in wilderness, it was possible for human beings to discern, to hear those voices. Okay? So in a sense, for Muir, his animism was grounded in, or embedded in, this pantheism. Okay? The entire natural world was sacred, and through diverse entities in the natural world, one could learn to listen to the earth's sacred voices. Okay? These kinds of sentiments are sometimes called by religious studies scholars, or referred to as pagan sentiments. Both animism and pantheism are often labeled paganism. Well, what did all this lead Muir to? Really a very complex character. He began to fight all sorts of environmental battles. He viewed grazing and other human activities in wilderness places as desecrations. He talked about sheep and sheep in particular as hooved locusts who desecrate sacred wilderness places. And he began to resist all sorts of human defilement of natural places. At the same time, because he believed that one could discern the sacred voices if he could just get people out in the natural world, and that people who had that perception would naturally have affection for the natural places and want to protect them, he also developed, when he founded the Sierra Club, ultimately he developed the Sierra Club Outings programs. The epistemological premise here, remember epistemology is just that fancy word that describes how we know what we know. So his theory of how we know what we know is that to really know about the sacred nature of the earth and to know about the sacred voices, you have to get people out in the wilderness. So the Sierra Club Outings were designed to do just that. So he had a deep tension within his own perspective. On the one hand, he thought, and I can almost quote him directly on this, that tourists, for example, weren't worthy of wilderness. They weren't worthy to come to these sacred places. On the other hand, he felt that if he didn't get tourists out into these wild places, they couldn't have their own spiritual experiences, and they thus couldn't learn to love these places, and thus they wouldn't act to protect them. One of the major Donnybrooks that Muir entered into was over a valley in Yosemite National Park. Yosemite had become a national park right around the turn of the century. That's in California. Many of you have probably seen pictures and picture books of this spectacular valley. But a part of the Yosemite Park was the Hetchy Valley. And John Muir resisted the efforts of Gifford Pinchot, interestingly enough, and others to dam Hetchy to provide water for San Francisco. Of course, there was great political pressure in the early part of this century after the fire in San Francisco in 1906 to provide more adequate water resources for the city. And so the power of the city, not uncommonly, ultimately won the battle to dam Hetchy. And as John Muir said late in his life, that battle just about killed him, losing Hetchy. But in any case, John Muir set up a tradition of what we might call deep ecological or pagan environmental activism. Now, a lot of folks until recently really didn't know the extent to which John Muir could accurately be called a pagan environmentalist. Why? Because he wasn't dumb. He was living in the early part of the century in a dominantly Christian culture, and he wanted to make a difference. So he tended to keep those kinds of experiences and perceptions to himself and his close friends. Or, if he alluded to those kinds of ideas, he tended to do so borrowing from his deep Christian background, borrowing Christian metaphors in order to make his more pagan points. So he tended to camouflage his animistic and pantheistic sentiments in Christian metaphors and Christian rhetoric. What I'd like to suggest to you is that if you look back at many of the major figures in the American conservation movement, people like Aldo Leopold, Joseph Wood Crutch, David Brower, to name just a few, you'll find the same kinds of spiritual sentiments. And again, Bob Marshall, the same kind of tendency to not express those sentiments in the public arena. We'll talk in a few minutes about what changed that made these kinds of environmentalists, that made pagan environmentalists come out of the closet, or at least some of them, and begin to articulate their perceptions and to even argue in the political arena for the protection of such of wilderness places in terms of their sacrality. Okay, well, what happened after the battle for Hetchy? After a few decades, or by the time a few decades had passed, interestingly enough, the Sierra Club, which was founded by Muir, begins to take on a philosophy that is more utilitarian and anthropocentric. By the way, if we're talking about pagan sentiments, here we can use the terms ecocentrism or biocentrism. And as you know from the readings, ecocentrism and biocentrism basically get at the idea that the natural world is inherently valuable. It's valuable apart from its usefulness to human beings. And utilitarian environmental ethics value the natural world to the extent that it's important and useful to human beings. Very big contrast here. Well, Muir would have probably been turning over in his grave, but after a few decades, it seemed as though the Sierra Club had attitudes much closer to Gifford Pinchot's and to the U.S. Forest Service than it did to John Muir, the early Sierra Club, or the NPS. Now, the NPS, of course, stands for the National Park Service. So in its early incarnations, the National Park Service is kind of analogous to John Muir. The National Park Service was more preservationist. Okay, preservationist. Gifford Pinchot and the U.S. Forest Service more conservationist. These are some of the ways in which scholars have distinguished between the two emerging traditions. Okay, so we see an environmental preservationist movement, one that is biocentric or ecocentric. Didn't use those terms at the time, but you can get the idea when Muir says things like, if it comes down to a war between humans and bears, I'd be tempted to side with the bears. You begin to see that human beings are not the only source of value for John Muir. Okay? Well, certainly that's not something that we could envision Gifford Pinchot saying. Well, so what I want to do is juxtapose this difference a little bit for you down through the next few centuries. Gifford Pinchot, U.S. Forest Service, a utilitarian perspective, a human-centered, anthropocentric perspective. John Muir, an ecocentric perspective, one that's grounded in essentially pagan perceptions and spiritual sentiments. But what happens next? The next major moment in the unfolding of an American conservation movement can be found in the life and work of Aldo Leopold. Leopold lived and worked in the first half of this century. The work for which he is most famous was published posthumously in 1948, a Sand County Almanac. And at the end of the Sand County Almanac, Leopold writes about what he calls the land ethic. And you can read in the Ecologist article some of the experiences that Leopold had that led him to the land ethic. But for the purposes right now, I just want to contrast it with these two perspectives up here. And just to paraphrase, basically what Leopold says is that a thing or actions are right to the extent that they ensure the flourishing of intact or whole ecosystems, what he calls the biotic community. Okay? A thing is right if it helps preserve natural processes, intact ecosystems. Things are wrong if they don't. Okay? So obviously here you have a holistic perspective. A thing is actions are not judged right and wrong based on whether or not they promote any individual human's well-being, unlike a rights theory, or even the well-being of humans only, a more utilitarian, community-centered ethics. But the well-being of entire ecosystems is what ought to guide human actions. Okay? So obviously, if we're going to figure out what the well-being of entire ecosystems is, we're going to have to know something about ecosystems, right? So you can see that there's a great impetus in this ethic for doing biological homework, scientific work, so that you can understand what the habitat requirements are and the ecosystem requirements are for every type of ecosystem that are present on the planet. So here were the seeds of a deeply ecocentric moral philosophy. He didn't flesh them out. He wasn't a philosopher, but this is considered to be a major moment in the development of an ecocentric moral perspective. Okay, well, what happens next? In terms of major watersheds in the American conservation movement? Well, as I suggested, the Sierra Club, to the minds of people over here, is sold out. David Brower, one of the early directors of the Sierra Club, ends up getting fed up and eventually booted out of the organization that he heads. David Brower. Why? Because he tried to get the Sierra Club to come back to the original vision of John Muir. What was the major battle that precipitated this conflict? Well, without going into all the gory details, it was over another dam, the Glen Canyon Dam, that drowned Glen Canyon, one of the most spectacular, probably second only to the Grand Canyon itself, one of the most spectacular canyons in the desert Southwest. Brower, along with a bunch of other Sierra Clubbers, fearing that if they didn't trade away Glen Canyon, they would lose Grand Canyon. Okay, this is, if I remember correctly, the battle around 1940s, 1950s. And eventually what happens is that they do trade away Glen Canyon. Glen Canyon Dam is built. Brower later repents of that compromise, says that he would never again trade away a place he'd never seen. He had never been there. And a whole bunch of other people felt the same way. There was a great deal of soul-searching and indeed outrage in the environmental community over this compromise, particularly among people who knew this place. Among those who were particularly outraged was the Southwestern novelist, or he prefers just to be called a writer, Edward Abbey. Edward Abbey had been working in the 1950s at Arches National Park and knew the Southwest very well. He was working as a ranger. And he eventually wrote a book about his 1950s desert experiences, a book called Desert Solitaire. In Desert Solitaire, it's a very interesting book. In Desert Solitaire, while on the one hand urging people to throw metaphysics to the dogs, in other words, he said, he basically denied that one could know the nature of ultimate reality, as he musingly put it, because I've never met any. He nonetheless talked about desert landscapes as sacred, holy places that needed to be protected just like any of the cathedrals that Western people have considered to be sacred. Moreover, he began to talk about the sacred duty of Americans to protect these places. And he began to talk about what he discovered as a ranger, that there was a resistance movement in the Southwest against the desecration of these places, against the defilement of these places. And he suggested in Desert Solitaire that that is the locus of our hope, the fact that there is a guerrilla movement against ecological devastation that is emerging. And indeed, this guerrilla movement requires wilderness, because wilderness is the habitat for the resistance to the desecration of these places. Moreover, Abbey reflected on the spiritual value of wilderness places, and he even went so far as to suggest that because of its austerity, the deserts were the places most capable of evoking in human beings proper spiritual perceptions. Because they gave no quarter to human beings, the deserts put people in their place, literally. What place? A place of recognizing their own insignificance. Okay? You start to see the anti-anthropocentrism here. If you are insignificant, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to base an ethics on human value. So for Abbey, wilderness places themselves were sacred. They deserved being protected. Human beings weren't all that hot. If they had any value at all, it was in their militant defense of sacred wilderness places. And for him, given his experiences and loves, desert ecosystems themselves. A few years later, in 1975, Edward Abbey wrote a second book, this time a novel, called The Monkey Wrench Gang. 1975, The Monkey Wrench Gang. The Monkey Wrench Gang chronicles a group of ragtag environmentalists who, in their frustration over the destruction of places they considered sacred, set out to resist, of all things, the Glen Canyon Dam. Their ultimate vision, aside from pranks like tearing down billboards and decommissioning bulldozers wherever they could be found that were involved in development projects throughout the Southwest, their ultimate objective was to take down Glen Canyon Dam, to blow up Glen Canyon Dam, and liberate the Colorado from behind it. Liberate that desecrating dam. Indeed, all of these acts of direct action, resistance, recounted in this book could be seen as acts of consecration or resacralization. Human acts resacralizing places considered to be sacred. Well, this book was not just pulled out of thin air. This book was based on things that were already happening in the Southwest. If you go through the Southwest now, you can't find a billboard that's on wood stilts anymore. It's all on metal stilts, because if it's wood, it's too easy to take down, and they're out there, and the environmental saboteurs are out there taking them down. Now, about the same time as Edward Abbey was starting to write like this, another important figure to this deep ecology movement, or the pagan environmental movement, emerged. And that's Gary Snyder. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the beatniks. Gary Snyder is one of 3 or 4 of the most prominent beat poets to emerge out of the San Francisco Bay Area during the beat renaissance of the 1950s. Here's a guy who grew up in the Northwest, in the woods, very early on had animistic and pantheistic spiritual sentiments, ended up working for the U.S. Forest Service, getting completely fed up, convinced that they were doing the devil's work, had also been influenced by a grandfather who was a wobbly, an international worker of the world, the radical leftist workers' union. The merger of that kind of non-Stalinist leftism, or at least he ended up within the non-Stalinist left, and that kind of pagan environmentalism, and his experience within the beat subculture of San Francisco, ultimately led to a book called Turtle Island. Now, Turtle Island was written in 1969, or was published in 1969. It won a Pulitzer Prize for poetry and prose. And in it, Snyder urges human beings to get, quote, back to the Pleistocene. Back to the Pleistocene. To go back to, he later amends this, by the way, to the Upper Paleolithic as he does more anthropological research. But here we get introduced into the idea of an idea that becomes very common in deep ecological thought and in the pagan environmental movement. The idea that the indigenous peoples of the planet tended, not absolutely, but tended to live harmoniously within their natural environments. And that we can learn from them. Both those that we can learn about anthropologically, in terms of ethnohistory, but we can learn from the remnant indigenous peoples who have yet been exterminated, for example, North American Indians and indigenous peoples elsewhere. We can learn from them certain things about how to live appropriately on the planet. Well, Edward Abbey Gary Snyder, become the, what we might call the central elders for what emerges soon thereafter, the Earth First movement or the radical environmental movement. Remember the Monkey Wrench Gang, published in 1975? By 1979, 1980, inspired by these kinds of ideas, a small group of people got together and founded an organization called Earth First. Right? Just think in terms of 1980. Earth First founded in 1980. What was the precipitating act that led to Earth First? Well, there was a big battle over a government process known as the RARE process. R-A-R-E. RARE. Roadless Area Evaluation. Roadless Area Review and Evaluation. This is a process that the U.S. Forest Service undertakes every 10 years. Basically, what's decided is where are we going to build roads and cut timber and extract resources in the next 10 years. So obviously a very important process. The environmentalists, many of them, went in and made what they considered to be biologically reasoned, well-researched arguments for protecting the places most characterized by biological diversity in North America. Their perception was that their opponents went in like a bunch of wild-eyed fanatics who were making arguments like, we have the sacred right to drive our off-highway vehicles anywhere we want. This is America, after all. We own America. We can drive our vehicles, our snowmobiles. We can hunt where we want, and it would be a violation of our sacred rights to private property, free enterprise, and so forth and so on, for the government to put any restrictions on that. These environmentalists felt like they came off like the great professionals. They wore the three-piece suits. They had their briefing books down. And that these other people who came in like lunatics, they felt like they didn't have a chance. But when the final decisions were made, to their mind, all that had been protected was what they call rocks and ice. Okay? The most scenic places, high in altitude, but places not characterized by biological diversity. Obviously, biologically diverse places tend to be lower elevation places, characterized by great biomass and a lot of different species. Okay? But also, where there's great biomass, there's lots of timber that can be extracted and a lot of money that can be made. So the government, basically, to their mind, didn't do much to protect the places that ecologically were most important in the minds of these environmentalists. So several of them resigned from their mainstream environmental organization because they had become convinced that a more radical approach was necessary. One, a more in-your-face, no-compromise attitude that they were fed up with. They were fed up with the kinds of compromise that led to Glen Canyon Dam and led to the results in the Rare 2 process. But also because they had a feeling that it was time that somebody began to advocate a vision of environmental protection based not on human self-interest, but on the intrinsic rights of all species to flourish, to fulfill their own evolutionary destinies. In short, part of what they wanted to do in forming this organization was to begin to argue for deep ecological ethics, or biocentric ethics. Most of these activists at the time didn't know that there was an idea called deep ecology. Deep ecology is a term coined in 1973 by Arne Naess, the Norwegian philosopher. Arne Naess, N-A-E-S-S. Very important article, 1973. And when these Earth Firsters learned about this philosophy of deep ecology that criticized mainstream environmentalism for its anthropocentrism and suggested that the natural world should be protected for its own sake, they felt like, many of them felt like they had come home. They had found their philosophy. Okay? And it was a nice, easy term that could be easily articulated. Deep ecology could be said to boil down to one basic idea, that the natural world is inherently valuable apart from its usefulness to human beings. Now, often obscured in public consciousness is the fact that it's really a deep spirituality that usually, but not always, leads to this perception of intrinsic value within the radical environmental movement. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. Okay, so early 1980, Dave Foreman, Mike Rozelle, and two others form Earth First. By 1985, Dave Foreman has published a book called Eco-Defense, which is basically like the anarchist's cookbook. It describes all sorts of techniques used to sabotage the engines of industrial destruction that Earth Firsters believe are destroying sacred wilderness ecosystems. Foreman himself, although he doesn't consider himself particularly religious, often speaks of our need to resacralize our land, to resacralize our perceptions of natural landscapes. Okay, well, what can be said about the ethics of radical environmentalism, the ethics of Earth First, as found in the early 1980s? And before I go to a video, that's what I want to summarize for you. Basically, I think it can boil down into three things. On the one hand, number one, a deeply spiritual biocentrism, or a deeply spiritual ecocentrism. Again, this idea that we ought to protect natural landscapes for their own sake. We want to provide a no-compromise approach. Many of these radicals thought that by articulating a no-compromise perspective that they would enhance the bargaining power of the mainstream groups. The mainstream groups, they thought, might be able to say, hey, you better deal with us, and you better deal with us in good faith, because if you don't, you know, those radicals are going to be out there terrorizing you. That's what they sort of hope might be part of the political dynamics. The second major pillar. Earth Firsters believed sincerely, based on their reading of the ecological sciences, that we are in an unprecedented extinction crisis. That we're in an unprecedented extinction crisis. Now, of course, if the natural world is intrinsically valuable, and all the species therein, and we're in the middle of a big extinction crisis, you can see there's a huge gap between the is and the ought. Okay? The ought is that we ought to protect all species. The is that we're not, that we're losing species by the thousands every year. So there's this huge chasm between is and ought. And so, obviously, that creates a moral obligation to try to do something to bridge that chasm. Well, what's the problem? Why is it so hard to bridge that chasm? Well, that leads us to the third pillar of what I'm calling radical environmental ethics, and that is political analysis. The ecological analysis gives them pillar 2. Political analysis gives them pillar 3. What's pillar 3? That we're in a crisis of democracy. Either democracy is a sham, according to the most radical of the Earth Firsters. It's completely meaningless, overridden as it is by corporate money and power. Or, for those who are not quite so pessimistic about, quite so critical of American democracy, it's not that democracy is a complete sham, but given the extent of the crisis, given the severity of the crisis, democratic processes and electoral politics simply are not up to the task of responding to the extinction crisis in enough time. Therefore, in addition to trying to make change through electoral processes, we have to employ any extra-legal tactic that will work. Okay? So extra-legal tactics are justified because democracy doesn't work. You can't work through the system, or even if you can't work through it on this issue because the crisis is so bad. Thus, monkey wrenching, ecological sabotage, or sometimes called ecotage, is morally justified. So is civil disobedience, direct action, efforts to create a mass movement through civil disobedience and to change the consciousness of the American public by being willing to suffer for one's convictions. Now, many of you know that I would say that those are the three main pillars of Earth First. Many of you would also know that within this radical environmental worldview, an awful lot of the folks would consider themselves to be anarchists, to reject certainly large-scale governments of any kind. Many of them, as I've suggested earlier, believe that we need to model our human lifeways after the lifeways of indigenous peoples and primal peoples, at least those who lived harmoniously within their ecosystems. And so there's a whole host of other ideas that often correspond with or go along with the radical environmental program. But to my mind, they're not necessarily the core, because you find people who have significant differences over it. The three pillars that I gave you are the pillars that I seem to find across what I'm calling the deep ecological movements, or the radical environmental movements. Now, what I'd like to do next is just to give you a little bit more flavor for all this verbiage. I'd like to play you a clip from a 60 Minutes piece with the founder, the most charismatic founder of Earth First, Dave Foreman. And then we'll talk a little bit about, well, let me just preface that by saying, in 1989, Dave Foreman and 4 others were arrested for that incident in the Arizona desert. Dave Foreman wasn't there, but he was brought in later as a co-conspirator. They claimed that he had given money to the people who were trying to down those power lines coming from nuclear power plants in the Southwest. So you'll see some of that reflected in this video. One of the reasons that they got on 60 Minutes, so holy cow, all of a sudden there's got environmentalists out there resorting to these kind of tactics. Oh my goodness, let's find out what's going on here. So that's a little bit of what this tape is about. Well, I think you'll find it interesting. Well, you can see that in 1989, the government wasn't ignoring what was happening with the emergence of this radical environmental movement. They had spent several $1 million to infiltrate it. They wanted to silence the message that was coming from this movement. In fact, one of the FBI agents, Mike Fain, forgot to turn off his tape recorder, went to a Burger King or something after a conversation with Dave Foreman, and was overheard on this tape to say, well, Dave Foreman isn't the one we need to pop in terms of being an actual perpetrator. Dave Foreman is the one we need to pop in order to send a message. But be that as it may, the official repression was not the, or official government repression was not the only reaction to the emergence of this movement. In 1989, Judy Berry and Daryl Cherney, 2 Northwest Forest activists, Earth First activists, were in the process of leaving Oakland en route to a university in Santa Cruz in Northern California, when a bomb blew up underneath Judy Berry's seat, permanently disabling her. She and Daryl Cherney, her passenger, were immediately arrested as terrorists. The FBI waged a several-month-long campaign portraying them as ecological terrorists in the press. They originally claimed that the bomb was behind Judy Berry's seat in plain view. Made all sorts of press releases about the nails from the bomb matching the ones at Judy Berry's house, and so forth and so on. No charges were ever filed. Eventually, Judy, in a lawsuit against the FBI and the Oakland police for failing to adequately investigate and look for the bomber, got pictures, and the pictures, which are now displayed around campus, show that indeed the bomb was underneath her seat, not behind the seat. That and the law enforcement record since then has led to the very recently to a congressional investigation led by Don Edwards, I believe a congressperson from California, and now that whole thing is proceeding. Others have recently been arrested. The first arrests for tree spiking in Washington and Idaho and Montana have come down from grand juries. There have been people incarcerated for refusing to testify at grand juries, including a fellow named Rick Scarce, who as a journalist and later as a sociology graduate student interviewed a lot of these environmental radicals. He's been in jail now for about 18 months. He could face up to another year for refusing to testify in front of the grand jury, despite the support of the American Sociological Association, which has passed resolutions in his defense, suggesting that the well-being of society demands free inquiry, and that's exactly what he was doing. So the authorities have not been laying down over the emergence of this movement. You should have some sense that this movement has been polarizing environmental conflicts and has been drawing a significant reaction. A lot of activists beat up. So the reaction to this movement is both official, governmental, law enforcement, and private. There have been private people who have infiltrated this group and brought back information to different groups in the so-called Revisionist movement and so forth. Okay, well now, the radicalism of this movement, both its moral radicalism and its willingness to use extra-legal tactics, and indeed some of that early anarchistic rhetoric that seemed to deny the legitimacy of the US government, served to draw a variety of subcultures into the movement. And interestingly enough, people like Dave Foreman, who you just heard interviewed, really didn't anticipate that his message would be attractive to certain social groups. So what are the social groups then that began to be drawn to Earth first? Well, first, some individuals from the New Age movement. The New Age movement. Now, what's the New Age movement? Well, some of you may be aware of Shirley MacLaine's stuff, the TV show Out on the Limb. The New Age movement promoting all sorts of deviant, and I don't mean that in a negative or pejorative way, but deviant spiritualities, everything from belief in UFOs to reincarnation to channeling, channeling of other entities. Now, there's a certain overlap between pagan spiritual sentiments and New Age sentiments, but by and large, the really New Age folks who were drawn to this movement have been run out. Earth First had a slogan, crystal free in '93. Well, they didn't quite achieve it, but New Age practices were largely ridiculed by movement people. But it wasn't as though every New Age belief was ridiculed. New Age beliefs that didn't meet the road in hardcore environmental activism were spurned. But there was a great tolerance for religious diversity within this movement. So certain New Age folks were drawn to the movement, and a lot of those folks kind of got re-socialized into an environmental militancy, and then they were okay to hang out. Certainly, the so-called neo-pagan movement, a lot of those folks have been drawn to Earth first and have been radicalized through their participation in it. Anarchists and punk subcultures, and more recently, punk subcultures have been drawn to it. I didn't know this until I got into this research, but the punk subculture is at a heavy dose of animal rights ideology, and that's drawn more animal rights people into the Earth First movement and has exacerbated tensions between ecocentrically oriented Earth First and animal rights oriented Earth First people. And finally, a variety of Marxists and other leftist rebels have been drawn to Earth First, especially with the decline of the Cold War. Sort of Earth First in some ways has become the only radicalism left in town. That has tended to draw in a lot of leftist political rebels. Now, as these streams flowed into Earth First, you can imagine it became less of a homogeneous social group, and it led to all sorts of tensions. Dave Foreman, who you've just seen, considers himself a redneck. In a sense, not completely, but there's parts of him that are like a patriotic American. You can see how he's drawing on patriotic myths, like the Boston Tea Party, to rationalize and justify his activism. Well, that kind of egocentrism and some of the worldview that goes with that didn't square very well with the more leftist background of somebody like Judy Berry, or the more anarchistic background of people who were sort of from the radical anarchist tradition. So in many ways, the center couldn't hold in Earth First, and by 1989, 1990, Dave Foreman had become convinced that he was going to have to leave. He couldn't sort of control what was going on there. He didn't identify with a lot of what was going on there. So he left to form his own group, which I'll describe in a minute. But what I want to do, in addition to point you to the Ecologist article or the Earth First Religious Radicalism article that you have in your reader, and I talk about the Earth First schism, and I suggest that it can best be understood by referring to some of the people as holies and other people as wilders. Look at that analysis of the schism. That'll give you some sense. But what I want to do is try to suggest that the different distributaries are even more plural. There are more different sorts of groups that are starting to shake themselves out of the original Earth First movement than I even was talking about in that article written a couple of years ago. So just like many religious movements, where there's all sorts of schisms and you get different spins on the religions with different theologies and so forth and so on. We're finding the same thing happening within the so-called radical environmental movement with deep ecology. Okay, well, how can we characterize these? Well, on the one hand, as I suggest, there are wilders, those people who tend to prioritize monkey wrenching as a strategy. On the other hand, there are the people I call holies, H-O-L-I-E-S, who tend to emphasize civil disobedience in the effort to build a mass movement. There are, I would break it down even further now, there are some that, I'm just working this out right now, so bear with me. I think there are some that I would probably just call the woo-woos for right now. The woo-woos prioritize, and again, I'm not using this in a pejorative sense, but they think that the primary strategy for social change should be to create spiritual change, spiritual consciousness change, and they are developing all sorts of innovative ritualizing as a means to spiritual consciousness transformation. And then, of course, most of them also are involved in various sorts of electoral politics and trying to put political pressure on the powers of it. So that's what unites them is that most of them are willing to use whatever means are necessary. And most of them would employ all of those strategies, monkey wrenching at one time or another. They would not be against monkey wrenching. They would be for civil disobedience in many cases. Think that spiritual transformation is important in most cases, and sometimes even electoral politics and political pressure. But one of the tensions in the movement is over what's the most effective strategy. So that's where some of the tensions are. But some of the tensions also go to or break down into different ecological philosophies. Okay, and many of you will be familiar with some of these types that I'm going to at least briefly mention. Next, well, Judy Berry, for example, is beginning to speak about what she calls revolutionary ecology. Now, revolutionary ecology represents the merger, on the one hand, of social ecology, significantly revised, but still heavily dependent on social ecology, and deep ecology. Now, of course, Judy would say that basically she had plenty of these kinds of ideas, but before she even knew that social ecology existed. But many of her pre-existing leftist ideas fit very well, or correlated well with the ideas of social ecology. Social ecology has a heavy dose of anti-hierarchical anarchism, and is often modeled after Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid, for those of you who are deeply into political philosophy. Another major social group that has emerged as part of the deep ecology movement is bioregionalism. Bioregionalism. Here, the priority for social change is on lifestyle changes, individual lifestyle changes, and regional community transformation. So, a lot of energy goes into energy efficiency, building energy efficient housing, environmentally low impact housing, composting toilets, organic gardening, and so forth and so on. Now, a lot of people involved in the bioregional movement are also involved in the overtly political tactics of Earth First, but there's also a bioregional movement that tends to have pretty much despaired of political action and is more interested in building an environmentally pure set of ecologically correct lifeways and ecologically correct communities. And then I've already mentioned the strategy of spiritual transformation. Some people are really prioritizing that, and we're finding rituals such as the Council of All Beings, which I've written about in that paper that you will be reading. There are things called breath workshops. Now there's a whole discipline called eco-psychology that has begun to emerge that I won't really be talking about right now. Now, last but not least, Dave Foreman, charismatic leader, that he has started his own initiative that he calls the Wildlands Project. The Wildlands Project. This is also sometimes called the North American Wilderness Recovery project. And the basic idea here is to facilitate the continent-wide, all the way from Central America to the northern reaches of Canada, to facilitate a biological survey of the entire continent, figuring out what the habitat requirements are for all the critters and all of the flora, and then figuring out what wilderness cores you need, what corridors you need to connect the wilderness cores so that flora and fauna can migrate appropriately given the various impacts that happen to them, and what sorts of buffer zones are needed around them to ensure Aldo Leopold's idea would be met. That is, that all ecosystems types would be able to flourish. And he has set out to work on developing this project, utilizing a variety of strategies and all sorts of different people, from people who are experts in geographic mapping systems to conservation biologists, politicians, and so forth. Their ultimate objective is to map the whole continent with the habitat requirements to ensure the preservation of biological diversity. Okay. Still definitely a very ecocentric approach, but given the repression of the state, he's lying low. He's not going around advocating a lot of monkey wrenching right now because he's on probation. So he's kind of got a different strategy. Okay, well that's kind of, this analysis that I've been giving you is still very much up in the air in my own mind, but it begins to illustrate some of the streams that were drawn together in the early 1980s in the so-called deep ecology movement, which again is nearly synonymous with what I'm calling the pagan environmental movement. How there have been schisms and splinters because the social groups that were drawn into that movement were not homogeneous enough for the center to completely hold. And yet it's striking that even amongst these quarreling factions, there's a sense among virtually all of these people that there's more that bind them together than separate them. Because in this culture, they still feel a lot more affinity with those who share ecocentric sentiments than they do with anybody whose environmental ethics are based on anthropocentric concerns. Okay, I think that's enough of an intro. That probably gives you enough of an understanding to know where Judy Berry fits in with the entire spectrum. Certainly the readings will help with that. Maybe we should take a break now. We're going to come back and discuss our classroom readings and go from there. And if there's specific questions about the lecture, maybe we can just handle just 5 minutes or so of that. Anything you need clarified before we go any further, we'll do that briefly right after the break.
What is his ethnic